The advertisement in the Times had been precise in its particulars: a furnished dwelling of considerable antiquity, remote situation, rent nominal, suitable for scholarly pursuits, requiring absolute solitude. Dr. Edmund Hartley, Fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford, had responded within the hour. His monograph on the decline of feudal institutions in the border counties demanded concentration impossible to achieve within the confines of the university, where colleagues perpetually sought his counsel and undergraduates knocked at all hours. What he required was isolation, complete, unbroken, and preferably surrounded by the very landscapes his research examined. Thus it was that on a drear afternoon in late October 1897, he found himself descending from the mail coach at the village of Thornwick, a huddle of grey stone cottages clinging to the Northumberland moors like barnacles to a weathered hull. The sky pressed low and leaden, and a wind from the east carried with it the promise of early winter. The inn, the Crossed Keys, stood at the village's solitary crossroads, a structure whose stones had witnessed centuries pass in this forgotten corner of England. Hartley pushed open the heavy oak door, grateful for the warmth that met him, though the eyes of the patrons clustered near the hearth held something less than welcome. The landlord, a man of perhaps 60 years, with the weathered countenance of one who had spent his youth at sea, approached with measured steps. "You'll be Dr. Hartley, I'm thinking." "I am. I trust the agent has made arrangements?" "Aye." The landlord's expression remained carefully neutral. "Mr. Grimshaw left word. You're to be taken to Brackenmore in the morning." "I had hoped to proceed this evening." "No one goes to Brackenmore after dark, sir." The words fell with a finality that permitted no discussion. "Besides, the path is treacherous even in daylight, and there's weather coming." Hartley felt a stirring of annoyance at this rustic superstition, but fatigue from his journey counseled acceptance. "Very well. I shall require accommodation for the night." As he signed the register, an elderly woman seated by the fire spoke without turning. "You'll not stay long at Brackenmore, young man. None ever do." "Mrs. Blackwood," the landlord cautioned. "Let him know what he's walking into, Thomas Merrick." She turned then, revealing a face carved into deep lines by time, and, Hartley fancied, something more than the usual cares of rural existence. 30 years since anyone dwelt there for more than a fortnight. The house remembers, you see, remembers what was done within its walls. "I am a man of science, madam," Hartley replied, with what he hoped was gentle firmness. "I do not concern myself with village legend. Science." She tested the word, as one might test suspect meat. "Science won't help you when you hear the footsteps on the stairs, when you see the light in the east tower where no light should be, when you understand why Silas Blackmore hanged himself from the rafters of his own dining hall." "That will do, Mrs. Blackwood." The landlord's voice carried more force now. He turned to Hartley with an apologetic expression. "The house has a history, sir. I'll not deny it. But stone and timber can't harm a man, whatever tales folk tell." Yet Hartley observed that the landlord's hand moved, almost unconsciously, to touch the iron horseshoe nailed above the doorframe. Morning brought no improvement to the weather. If anything, the sky had darkened further, and rain fell in sheets that transformed the moorland into a grey desolation. The trap that arrived for Hartley was driven by a young man who introduced himself as Will Thornton, grandson to the agent Grimshaw. He possessed the broad shoulders and taciturn manner common to those who work the land, and he volunteered no conversation as they departed Thornwick. The road, if such it could be called, wound upward through increasingly wild country. Hartley, despite his determination to remain skeptical of local superstition, felt his spirits sink with each passing mile. The landscape possessed a quality of profound isolation, as though they traveled not merely away from civilization, but backward through time itself, into an age when England remained dark and unknown, when things older than Christianity still held dominion over certain wild places. After perhaps an hour, Will pulled the horse to a halt at a point where the track divided. To the left, it continued across the open moor. To the right, a narrower way descended into what appeared to be a shallow valley, though the rain made it difficult to distinguish features with any clarity. "Brackenmore lies down there," Will said, his first words since leaving Thornwick. "I'll take you to the door, but I'll not come inside, and I'll not fetch you until the fortnight is up, as arranged. You'll find provisions laid in. The agent saw to that last week. I understood there to be a caretaker. There was. Old Joseph Mather looked after the place near 20 years. He died this past Michaelmas." Will's expression remained carefully neutral. "In his sleep," the doctor said. "Though he was found sitting upright in his chair, eyes open, mouth shaped like he was screaming. The doctor said it was his heart." Before Hartley could formulate a response, the trap lurched forward down the rightward path. The descent was steep, and within minutes the moor above vanished into rain and mist. They entered a landscape of stunted trees, their branches twisted by prevailing winds into shapes suggestive of tortured limbs. A stream ran alongside the track, swollen with rain, its voice a constant melancholy rushing. Then, quite suddenly, Brackenmore revealed itself. The house stood at the valley's nadir, a structure of 3 stories, built in the local gray stone, with a tower rising from its eastern end, like an accusatory finger pointing at heaven. Its windows were numerous, but narrow, like suspicious eyes. The architecture belonged to no single period. Rather, it appeared that successive generations had added to the original structure in piecemeal fashion, creating an asymmetry that was somehow more unsettling than frank ugliness would have been. Ivy covered much of the southern wall, and several chimneys rose from the roof at odd angles, suggesting a warren of rooms within. A wall perhaps 7 feet high surrounded the immediate grounds, with a gate of wrought iron that stood open. Will drove the trap through and pulled to a halt before the main entrance. A door of blackened oak beneath a stone portico carved with symbols Hartley recognized as pre-Norman. "The key's under the 3rd stone to the left of the step," Will said. "There's wood for the fires and oil for the lamps. The well's sound. Anything else you need, you'll have to do without until I return." He paused, then added, "There's a bell in the entrance hall. It's connected to a rope that runs to the gate. If you should need to leave before the fortnight's up, ring it. I check from the road each morning. I'll see the bell moving and come for you. That seems an unnecessary precaution for a man who intends to work undisturbed." Will said nothing, merely waited as Hartley retrieved his trunk and bags. The moment the luggage touched the ground, he turned the trap and urged the horse back up the track with an alacrity that spoke eloquently of his desire to be quit of the place. Hartley watched until the trap disappeared into the rain and mist. Then, alone in the downpour, he turned to examine his accommodation for the next fortnight. The interior of Brackenmore proved both better and worse than he had anticipated. Better in that the rooms, while heavy with dust, were structurally sound and furnished after a fashion. Worse in that they possessed an atmosphere of profound melancholy that seemed to emanate from the very stones. The entrance hall was paneled in dark wood and dominated by a staircase that ascended into shadows the afternoon light barely penetrated. The bell Will had mentioned hung from a beam, its rope disappearing through a hole in the ceiling. Hartley spent the remainder of the daylight hours exploring. The ground floor consisted of the entrance hall, a dining room with a long table capable of seating 20, a library whose shelves held nothing but dust and mouse droppings, a kitchen that had clearly not been used for cooking in decades, and several smaller rooms whose purpose was obscure. He found the wood and oil Will had mentioned, along with provisions sufficient for his needs. Tinned goods, flour, tea, and a quantity of salt pork that would become tiresome, but was at least substantial. The first floor contained bedrooms, 6 in all, each furnished with a bedstead, wardrobe, and washstand. Hartley selected the largest at the front of the house, for its windows overlooked the approach and would provide good light for reading. The room at the rear, he noted, had its door not merely closed, but bolted from the outside, a curiosity he resolved to investigate when more pressing concerns had been addressed. He did not ascend to the second floor that evening. Exhausted from travel and damp from the rain, he instead laid a fire in his chosen bedroom, arranged his books and papers, and prepared a simple meal in the kitchen. By the time full darkness had fallen, he was installed in a chair before the fire with a plate of bread and tinned beef, his manuscript spread on a small table beside him. The silence was absolute. After years in Oxford, where the clamor of city life provided constant background noise, Hartley found the quiet of Brackenmore almost tangible, a presence in itself. He could hear the crack of wood in the fireplace, the soft pattering of rain against the windows. And beneath these sounds, another, a low, rhythmic creaking that might have been timbers settling, or might have been something else. He forced his attention to his work. The chapter he was revising concerned the dissolution of monastic holdings in the border regions following Henry VIII's reforms, dry material requiring careful documentation. Yet he found his concentration wandering. The room, despite the fire, maintained a chill that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Shadows gathered in the corners with an almost deliberate quality, and more than once he found himself glancing toward the door, certain he had heard a footstep in the corridor beyond. Suggestion and isolation, he muttered to himself. Nothing more. Mrs. Blackwood's tales working upon a tired mind. Nevertheless, when he finally retired to bed near midnight, he found himself doing something he had not done since childhood, checking that the door was firmly latched and placing a chair against it for good measure. He woke in absolute darkness to absolute silence. Something had disturbed him, pulled him from sleep with the suddenness of an alarm. Yet he could detect no sound save his own breathing and the frantic hammering of his heart. The fire had died to embers, providing barely enough light to distinguish the room's outlines. Rain no longer pattered against the windows. Then he heard it, footsteps in the corridor outside his room. Slow, measured, with an odd dragging quality, as though the walker favored one leg or wore something that scraped against the floorboards with each step. Hartley sat upright, every sense alert. The logical portion of his mind insisted that the sound was nothing more than the house settling, that old buildings made countless noises in the night. Yet the footsteps possessed a rhythm unmistakably human, a purposeful cadence that spoke of intention rather than random creaking. They passed his door, continued toward the rear of the house, stopped. For perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt immeasurably longer, silence reigned once more. Then came a sound that raised the hair on Hartley's neck, the slow drawing of a bolt, metal against metal, followed by the groan of hinges that had not been oiled in years. The bolted room. Something had opened the bolted room. He fumbled for matches, lit the oil lamp on his bedside table. The flame seemed pitifully inadequate against the darkness, but it restored a measure of rationality. Ghosts did not unbolt doors. Either he had heard an ordinary sound misinterpreted by his sleep-fogged senses, or there was something corporeal in the house with him. The second possibility was, in its way, more disturbing than the first. Hartley rose, pulled on his dressing gown, and took up the lamp. The chair he had placed against the door seemed a theatrical gesture in the lamplight, evidence of superstitious fear unworthy of an educated man. He removed it and opened the door. The corridor stretched before him, empty and silent. The other bedroom doors stood as he had left them, open or closed according to his afternoon explorations. But at the corridor's end, the bolted door now stood ajar, and from the darkness beyond it came a sound that might have been breathing, or might have been the wind. Every instinct urged Hartley to retreat, to lock himself in his room until daylight returned. Yet his rational mind rebelled at such cowardice. He was a fellow of Oxford, a man of learning and science. He would not be driven into hiding by sounds in the night, whatever their source. He advanced along the corridor, lamp held before him like a talisman. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, and shadows danced along the walls in response to the lamp's movement. The breathing sound, if such it was, had ceased, leaving only the profound silence that seemed to be Brackenmoor's natural state. He reached the open door and raised the lamp to illuminate the room beyond. It was smaller than the others, barely more than a large closet. The walls were bare stone, and an iron ring was bolted into the wall at shoulder height. But what arrested Hartley's attention was the floor. It had been scrubbed recently. The smell of lye lingered in the air, yet in the lamplight he could discern darker patches in the wood, stains that no amount of scrubbing had entirely removed. And scratched into the stone of the wall, at the height where a person kneeling might reach, were words in a hand that had clearly been carved with great effort. God forgive me for what I did to them. God forgive me for what they made me do. God, the third line ended mid-word, the final letters trailing off as though the writer's strength had failed. Hartley backed from the room, his breath coming rapidly. The bolted door. This had been a cell. Someone had been imprisoned here, confined in this tiny space for purposes he dared not contemplate. And the stains on the floor. A sound from below, jerked his attention toward the staircase. Footsteps again, but these were ascending, climbing toward him with the same dragging, purposeful gait he had heard earlier, and with them came another sound, a low moaning, rising and falling, wordless but expressive of such agony and despair that Hartley felt his courage threatening to desert him entirely. The lamplight seemed to dim, as though something was draining the very illumination from the air. The temperature plummeted. Hartley could see his breath misting before him in great clouds. And still the footsteps climbed, closer now, reaching the landing, turning towards him. He ran, rational thought abandoned. He fled to his room, slammed the door, and dragged every piece of furniture he could manage against it. The lamp he set upon the mantelpiece, its light now the only thing standing between him and absolute darkness, for the embers in the fireplace had died entirely. The footsteps stopped outside his door. "Please," Hartley whispered, unsure whether he was praying or pleading with whatever stood beyond that thin barrier of wood. "Please." A sound came from the corridor, wet, labored breathing, like lungs damaged beyond all healing, struggling to draw air. Then a voice, hoarse and broken, "Let them out." What? Hartley's own voice was barely audible. Let who out? They're still here, in the walls, in the stones, all of them. Let them out. I don't understand. Tell me what you want. Tell me who you are. But the presence, for he could feel it now, a weight of malevolence and suffering that pressed against the door like a physical thing, made no further response. Instead, the breathing gradually faded, and with it, the terrible cold. After a time, the normal night sounds of the house returned, the creak of timber, the whisper of wind around the eaves. Hartley did not move from his position against the barricaded door until gray dawn light began to seep through the windows. The morning revealed nothing. In daylight, the house was merely old and neglected, not sinister. The bolted room contained no marks on the walls. Hartley examined it minutely, and the floor, while old and stained, bore only the discolorations common to ancient wood. Had he imagined the scratched words? Surely not, yet they were not there now. He made himself breakfast. His hands shook only slightly as he prepared tea, and resolved to spend the day in rational investigation. If Brackenmore held secrets, they would be discovered through research and observation, not through cowering in fear. The library proved more useful than he had anticipated, though most of its shelves were empty. A cabinet in one corner yielded a collection of documents, property deeds, household accounts, and a history of the estate compiled, according to its flyleaf, by a local antiquarian in 1823. Hartley spent the morning reading, and what he learned chilled him more thoroughly than the previous night's encounter. Brackenmore had been built in the early 15th century by Sir Robert Blackmore, a knight whose wealth derived from sources the chronicler delicately described as spoils of war and other ventures in the borderlands. The estate had passed through 8 generations of Blackmores, each seemingly more dissolute than the last, until it came into the possession of Silas Blackmore in 1852. Silas, the chronicler noted, with obvious discomfort, had been a man of peculiar interests. He traveled extensively on the continent, corresponded with practitioners of mesmerism and other dubious sciences, and was rumored to have joined certain societies whose rituals were incompatible with Christian faith. Upon inheriting Brackenmore, he returned with a foreign bride, a woman from some unnamed Eastern European principality, and began a program of philosophical researches about which his neighbors were not informed. The household at that time consisted of Silas, his wife, and a staff of perhaps a dozen servants. Within 2 years, all of the servants had left, fled, according to some accounts, citing influences in the house they would not name. Silas and his wife remained alone at Brackenmore for another 3 years, during which time no one from the village was permitted to enter the grounds. Then, in the winter of 1857, a terrible screaming was heard coming from the house, screaming that continued for 3 days without ceasing. On the 4th day, silence fell. When concerned neighbors finally forced their way inside, they found Silas Blackmore hanging from the dining-room rafters, dead some hours. His face, witnesses reported, was fixed in an expression of terror beyond anything they had seen in decades of attending deathbeds. Of his wife, no trace was ever found. The house stood empty for years thereafter. Eventually, a distant cousin inherited and attempted to take up residence, but departed after a single night, refusing ever to speak of what he had experienced. The property passed through several hands, each owner attempting and failing to let or sell it, until it came into the possession of the Grimshaw family, who had served as land agents in the region for generations. They had, it seemed, given up hope of finding any but the most desperate or skeptical of tenants. Hartley closed the book and sat in silence, staring at nothing. The rational explanation would be that Silas Blackmore had descended into madness, perhaps murdering his wife and then taking his own life in remorse. The screaming would have been her death throes, the subsequent hauntings merely the product of suggestion and village gossip. Yet something in him rejected this neat conclusion. He thought of the cell upstairs, of the words scratched into stone, words that had been there. Regardless of what his morning inspection had revealed, he thought of the voice in the darkness. Let them out. Let who out? The wife? The servants? Or something else entirely? He spent the afternoon exploring the tower, the one portion of the house he had not yet examined. The entrance was accessed through a narrow door off the dining room, and a spiral stair of stone wound upward through 3 levels. The first level contained only storage, broken furniture, trunks of moldering clothes, and the accumulated detritus of centuries. The second level was empty save for a single chair, positioned before the narrow window, facing out over the moor. Someone had sat here, Hartley realized, for long hours. The stone floor before the chair was worn smooth by restless feet. The third level, at the tower's summit, was locked. Hartley had no key, but the door itself was old, and the lock yielded to a determined application of a poker from one of the fireplaces below. The door swung inward with a shriek of protesting hinges. The smell hit him first, a combination of mildew, decay, and something else, something organic and sweet that spoke of corruption. The room was circular, perhaps 15 feet in diameter, with windows on all sides, and covering every inch of the walls, written in what appeared to be charcoal, mixed with something darker, were words, thousands of words, tens of thousands, written in multiple hands, in multiple languages, English, French, Latin, and others Hartley did not recognize. They spiraled from floor to ceiling, overlapping, intersecting, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. Some were prayers, some were curses, Some were simply names, repeated again and again: Elsbeth, Samuel, Mary, John, Thomas. And in the center of the room, drawn in the same dark substance, was a circle perhaps 6 feet across. Within it were symbols that Hartley recognized from his study of medieval texts: hermetic signs, Kabbalistic figures, sigils whose meanings were obscure but whose purpose was unmistakable. This was a conjuring circle, a means of summoning and binding. But binding what? And where were they now? He heard the voice again, though whether it came from outside his head or within he could not say. In the walls, in the stones. Let them out. Hartley stumbled backward from the room, his mind reeling. What had Silas Blackmore done in this place? What had he summoned? And what had become of those he had used in the summoning? The light was failing, afternoon shading into evening with the swiftness common to late October. Hartley descended the tower stairs, his thoughts in turmoil. He should leave. Ring the bell, summon Will Thornton, and depart this cursed house immediately. His academic research could proceed perfectly well in Oxford, whatever interruptions he might face. Yet something held him. Perhaps it was scholarly curiosity, the desire to understand what had occurred here. Perhaps it was something less noble, a stubborn refusal to admit that there were forces in the world his rational philosophy could not encompass. Or perhaps, most disturbing of all, it was because some part of him wanted to know what would happen when night fell once more. He prepared for the coming darkness with methodical care. Every lamp in the house was filled with oil and lit. He laid fires in 4 different rooms, ensuring he would have warmth and light wherever he might need to retreat. He ate a substantial meal, forcing himself to chew and swallow, though his appetite had fled. And he took a heavy iron poker from the library fireplace, placing it within easy reach. Then, as night settled over Brackenmore like a shroud, he positioned himself in the entrance hall and waited. The house came alive as darkness deepened. Sounds emerged from the walls themselves, scraping, rustling, and occasionally something that might have been speech too distorted to comprehend. The temperature dropped steadily despite the fires, until Hartley could see his breath misting in the lamplight. At 9 o'clock, by his pocket watch, he heard the footsteps descending from the upper floors, the same dragging gait, the same purposeful rhythm, but this time, as the presence reached the entrance hall, it did not stop or hide in shadows. It manifested. The figure that took shape in the lamplight was barely human, gaunt beyond the point of emaciation, clad in the rotting remnants of a frock coat. It stood perhaps 6 feet tall, but seemed to loom larger through some quality of presence that defied physical dimension. Its face was a horror, flesh stretched over bone, eyes sunken but gleaming with a terrible awareness, mouth hanging open to reveal teeth that had lengthened into something almost canine. But it was the wounds that transfixed Hartley, wounds that covered the figure's neck and wrists, deep cuts that gaped bloodlessly, as though the thing had died from having its throat and veins opened while suspended in air. "Silas Blackmore," Hartley whispered, the figure's head turned toward him with a motion that contained too many joints. When it spoke, the voice was the same he had heard the previous night, hoarse, broken, wet. "I tried to transcend. I tried to master the forces that govern the boundaries between life and death, between spirit and matter. I studied in Prague, in Constantinople, in places whose names are not spoken in daylight. And I learned. God help me, I learned. What did you do? Hartley found his voice, though it trembled. What did you do to your wife? To your servants? I needed anchors, channels through which the energies could flow. Willing participants at first, the servants, drawn by promises of wealth and knowledge. My wife, the thing that had been Silas Blackmore, made a sound that might have been a sob. My beloved Elena, she believed in my work. She trusted me. You killed them. I transformed them, or tried to. The theory was sound. Human consciousness could be separated from the corporeal form and bound into the very stones of a structure, creating a bridge between worlds. Through them, I would achieve mastery over death itself. They would be immortal in their fashion, and I would wield powers that only the greatest adepts had ever approached. But something went wrong. Everything went wrong. The figure drifted closer, and Hartley gripped the poker, though he knew it would be useless against such a thing. The binding worked too well. Their consciousness did separate from their bodies, but they could not be freed. They remained trapped in the walls, in the stones, in the very fabric of Brackenmore, aware, suffering. Unable to die, unable to live. I hear them still, their screaming, their pleading. It never stops. It has never stopped for 60 years. And you, I tried to release them. When I finally understood what I had done, I spent weeks attempting to undo the binding. But the knowledge required to create such a working is not the same knowledge required to unmake it. In my desperation, I thought that if I made myself a bridge, if I shed my own blood within the circle and offered my life as a final sacrifice, perhaps the energy would dissipate, and they would be freed. But you failed. I succeeded only in binding myself as I had bound them. My body died, but my consciousness remained, tethered to this place, forced to witness the suffering I inflicted. The hell I created for others became my own eternal damnation. Hartley felt an unexpected wave of pity wash over his fear. Is there no way to release you? To release all of you? Only one. The figure's eyes fixed on him with desperate intensity. The binding requires consciousness to maintain it. It feeds on awareness, on the energy of trapped souls. But if those souls could be dispersed, if their essence could be distributed beyond the confines of Brackenmore, I don't understand. Someone living must willingly take our place, must enter the circle in the tower and perform the ritual of transference. The consciousness trapped here would flow into the new vessel, and with living will, that person could walk beyond the boundaries of the estate, breaking the binding through simple distance. Once beyond the walls, the souls would dissipate, finally granted the death that should have been theirs decades ago. And the person who performs this transference? Silas Blackmore's silence was answer enough. You want me to trap myself here in your stead, Hartley said slowly, to condemn myself to an eternity of suffering so that you might be free. No, you misunderstand. The figure's voice carried a weight of earnestness. The binding would break once you passed beyond the walls. You would be a vessel, yes, but only temporarily. A few hours of discomfort, visions, perhaps, voices, but nothing more. You would free 13 souls from eternal torment at the cost of a single difficult night. Hartley wanted to believe him. More than that, he wanted to help. The scientist in him recoiled at the thought of consciousness trapped in endless suffering, regardless of how it had been achieved. But something in the figure's manner, some quality of desperation, warned him that the truth was not as simple as presented. "I need time to consider," he said. "There is no time." The figure's composure cracked, revealing the anguish beneath. "Every moment we remain bound here is an eternity of torment. You cannot imagine what it is to be conscious but unable to move, to feel but unable to express, to scream without voice or sound. We are in hell, Dr. Hartley, a hell of my creation, but hell nonetheless. I beg you, end it, please." But Hartley shook his head, backing toward the staircase. "I will give you my answer tomorrow. I must think, must study, must understand fully what you ask." "Tomorrow may be too late." "Too late for what? You have endured 60 years. You can endure one more night." He turned and fled up the stairs, the figure's anguished cries following him. "Don't leave me here. Don't leave us here. Please, please." Hartley did not sleep that night. Instead, he returned to the tower, to the room of words, and by lamplight he read. It took hours, parsing the overlapping script, the multiple languages, the frantic scribblings of minds pushed beyond endurance. But gradually, a picture emerged, a picture far darker than what Silas Blackmore's revenant had described. The servants had not been willing participants. They had been prisoners, confined in the cell Hartley had found, brought up one by one to the tower, and subjected to rituals that had torn their consciousness from their bodies while they still lived. The names on the walls were their own signatures, written in their death throes as the last act of doomed hands. And Elena Blackmore, she had not believed in her husband's work. She had discovered it, had threatened to report him to authorities, and he had made her the first subject of his experiments, binding her consciousness into the very foundations of the house, while her body was disposed of in ways the text did not specify, but strongly implied. But the most chilling discovery was this: the transference ritual Silas described was not an act of mercy. It was an act of propagation. Anyone who entered the circle and performed the rite would indeed become a vessel for the trapped consciousness. But they would not disperse upon leaving Brackenmoor's grounds. Instead, they would carry that consciousness out into the world, where it would seek new vessels, new victims, creating an expanding web of trapped and suffering souls. Silas Blackmore had not been trying to undo his crimes. He had been trying to complete them. Hartley descended from the tower as dawn broke, his mind clear for the first time since entering Brackenmoor. He knew what he had to do. The revenant manifested as he reached the entrance hall, desperate and pleading. "Have you decided? Will you help us?" "I cannot," Hartley said. "I know what you truly are, what you truly intend. The ritual you describe would not free the souls you've trapped. It would spread the binding like a contagion. No, you've misunderstood. The texts are written by your victims. I have read their account of what you did to them. There will be no transference, no ritual, no escape through me." The figure's aspect changed. The pleading expression twisted into something malevolent, the pretense of humanity falling away to reveal the corrupted soul beneath. "Then you will join us," it snarled. "If you will not be our vessel, you will be our companion in suffering." The temperature plummeted, the lamps flickered and dimmed, and from the walls themselves came sounds, moaning, weeping, the screaming of 13 souls in eternal agony. The house seemed to contract, the walls pressing inward, as though Brackenmore itself had become a vast throat seeking to swallow him. But Hartley had one advantage that Silas Blackmore could not have anticipated. He was still alive, still possessed of a physical body that could act upon the material world. He ran to the library, snatched up the lamp he had left burning there, and hurled it against the wall. The glass shattered. Oil splashing across ancient paneling that had not seen water in decades. Flames spread with gratifying speed. No! The revenant manifested before him, its form more solid than before, hands reaching out. "You'll destroy us all." "Yes," Hartley agreed. "I will destroy the prison, and in destroying it, I will release the prisoners. Fire cleanses, fire transforms. If your victims cannot be freed through ritual, perhaps they can be freed through raising the very stones that hold them." He ran through the house, overturning lamps, spreading flame. The structure was old and dry. It caught like kindling. Smoke filled the corridors, and through it he glimpsed other figures taking shape. The servants, the wife, all the victims of Silas Blackmore's ambition. But they were not attacking. They were watching, waiting, hoping. The entrance was ahead. Hartley burst through the front door and stumbled down the steps, falling to his knees on the gravel drive. Behind him, Brackenmore burned. The flames spread with supernatural speed, as though the house itself welcomed destruction, and within the roar of the conflagration he heard voices, not screaming now, but singing, a hymn perhaps, or simply the sound of souls released from bondage. However, that release had come. The tower was the last to fall. It stood like a candle against the dawn sky for long minutes, while the rest of the structure collapsed into ruin. Then, with a groan that seemed to come from the earth itself, it toppled sideways and crashed into the inferno. Hartley sat on the gravel, watching Brackenmore die, until he heard the sound of hoofbeats. Will Thornton appeared, driving the trap at a desperate pace, his face pale with shock. "I saw the smoke from the road. Are you hurt? What happened?" "The house caught fire," Hartley said, his voice hoarse from smoke. "An accident with a lamp. I barely escaped." Will stared at the conflagration, his expression unreadable. Then, quietly, he said, "My grandfather, Agent Grimshaw. He'll not be pleased. The property was worth—" "Nothing," Hartley interrupted. "It was worth nothing, less than nothing. Tell your grandfather I will compensate him for the loss, whatever sum he deems appropriate. But Brackenmore should never have been let to anyone. It should have been destroyed decades ago." Will said nothing for a long moment, watching the flames. Then, "My great-grandmother was one of the servants who worked here. Before she left, before they all left. She never spoke of what she saw, but she woke screaming until the day she died." He paused. "Perhaps some things are better burned." They remained silent as the sun climbed higher, dispersing the morning mist. The flames began to subside as they ran out of fuel, leaving only blackened stone and ash. And, as Hartley watched, he could have sworn he saw figures in the smoke, translucent, ascending, fading into the morning light, like breath on a winter day. 13 figures, rising, released at last. "Come," Will said eventually. "There is nothing more to be done here. I'll take you back to Thornwick." Hartley climbed into the trap, his clothes reeking of smoke, his hands blackened with soot. As they ascended the track back toward the moor, he looked back only once. The ruins of Brackenmore smoldered in their valley, already beginning to seem like something from a dream rather than solid reality. Yet he knew it had been real. All of it had been real. At the crossed keys, Mrs. Blackwood sat in her customary chair by the fire. She looked up as Hartley entered, searched his face, and nodded slowly. "You burned it," she said. "Not a question. I burned it." "Good. Should have been done years ago. But no one ever had the courage." She paused, then added, "Did they suffer? At the end?" Hartley thought of the voices in the flames, the figures rising through the smoke. "No," he said. "I don't believe they suffered. I believe they were grateful." Mrs. Blackwood's eyes glistened, but she merely nodded again and returned her gaze to the fire. Hartley took a room for the night. He bathed, burning his smoke-damaged clothes in the inn's furnace, and ate a simple meal that tasted better than anything he had consumed in days. Then he retired early, exhausted beyond measure, and slept without dreams. He departed Thornwick the following morning on the mail coach, his trunk packed, his manuscript carefully stowed. The monograph on feudal institutions would have to be completed in Oxford after all. He found he did not mind. As the coach climbed away from the village, he glimpsed the valley where Brackenmore had stood. Even from this distance he could see the blackened ruins. In time, he supposed, they would be reclaimed by the moor, stones scattered, foundations overgrown, until nothing remained but vague shapes in the landscape and fading stories told by the old folk on winter nights. Perhaps that was as it should be. Some knowledge was not meant to be preserved. Some experiments should never have been attempted, and some houses, having served as vessels for human suffering, deserved no memorial save the merciful oblivion of total destruction. The coach rattled onward, carrying him away from Northumberland, away from Brackenmore, away from the events of those 2 terrible nights. Yet Hartley knew he would never forget. In quiet moments he would remember the words scratched into stone, the voices in the walls, the figure of Silas Blackmore trapped by his own ambition in an eternity of regret. And he would remember the hymn, if such it was, that had risen from the flames as Brackenmore burned. It had sounded, he thought, like relief, like joy, like the first true rest those 13 souls had known in 60 years. He had come to Brackenmore seeking isolation for scholarly work. Instead, he had found something far older and darker than any historical institution, a reminder that human ambition, unchecked by conscience or compassion, could create hells that required neither devil nor divine judgment. People could do that to one another, had done it, would do it again in different forms, in different places. But they could also, when courage permitted, undo such evil, not perfectly, not without cost, but completely enough to matter. 3 weeks later, in his rooms at Magdalen College, Hartley received a letter bearing a Northumberland postmark. It was from Agent Grimshaw, written in a surprisingly steady hand for a man of his years. "Dr. Hartley, I am in receipt of the account provided by my grandson regarding the destruction of Brackenmore. I have also received your bank draft in compensation for the loss of the property, which sum far exceeds any realistic valuation. I write not to discuss financial matters, however, but to inform you of something that may be of interest. Following the fire, I engaged workmen to clear the site, as the ruins presented a hazard. In the course of this work, they discovered beneath the foundations a chamber that had not been accessible from the house proper, a crypt of some antiquity, predating the Blackmore occupation. Within this crypt were found the remains of 12 individuals, disposed without ceremony or marker. Medical examination suggests they had been dead for several decades. A 13th set of remains was found buried separately in a stone sarcophagus bearing the name Elena Blackmore, beloved wife. All have been given proper Christian burial in the Thornwick churchyard. The vicar performed the service, and a substantial portion of the village attended, though most could not have said precisely why they felt compelled to do so. You need not respond to this letter. I write merely to inform you that what you did at Brackenmore, whatever the cost to my family's business, was a service to the dead and a blessing to the living. The valley sleeps quiet now, they say. The birds have returned. And Mrs. Blackwood, who has suffered from nightmares these 40 years past, tells me she has slept peacefully every night since the house burned. Some debts cannot be measured in currency. Please accept my gratitude, and know that you are welcome in Thornwick, should you ever return to Northumberland, though I suspect you will not. Respectfully, Horace Grimshaw Hartley folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. He would not return to Northumberland. That chapter of his life was closed. Yet, as autumn deepened and the Oxford air grew chill, he found himself returning again and again to certain questions. How many other houses stood empty across England, across Europe, across the world? Houses with their own secrets, their own trapped souls. How many Silas Blackmores had there been throughout history, pursuing knowledge without wisdom, power without conscience? And how many of those imprisoned spirits still waited, voiceless and forgotten, for someone to hear them? He did not know, could not know. But on certain nights, when the wind rattled his windows and the college buildings settled into their centuries-old stones, he listened, just in case. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to Dreamspire for more Gothic mysteries and classic horror. Thank you for listening.